A very warm welcome to all of you. Today we are at the third in this speaker series, and as I can see in terms of number and in terms of the content, we are, because each one cannot be compared, but at least quantitatively we are stepping forward and growing. So that's very encouraging. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Redding from Switzerland, and also the Dean of the Overseas Family School, and welcome to all the students also from the school. So we hope that we can also give message for the next generation of the audience and the scholars who will emerge in the society. A little bit of introduction about the Global Asia Institute to give you the context why we are having this kind of meeting. There is now wide awareness that the globalization is shifting the anchor and the focus on Asia, and so the future of the global economy will be largely determined by what happens in Asia. It provides fantastic opportunities, but together with it comes several challenges, and these we have grouped them into three themes, if I may simplify. One of them is, as you've been now reading in the newspapers and so on, how the major global economic trends are actually affecting the rest of the world, and particularly in Asia. Now there's a lot of attention on Europe, but there's also enough discussion on what will happen or what is happening in Asia. The second stream is, while the North American and European societies transformed over centuries or even several decades, Asia is transforming very, very rapidly. In fact, all the changes that we are seeing in Asia is only a couple of decades in the way it is growing at 8-10% annually. So much of it is also happening in the urban parts of Asia. So these are the capital cities of states or provinces in various countries, particularly India, China. Together they themselves hold a couple of billions of people who will be making changes in the global economy. And the third stream then relates to that. You know, many of the, including the young people here, we will be born in cities, live in cities, and maybe retire in cities. So cities bring together new types of challenges. How do you provide the same facilities in terms of healthcare, education, and other infrastructure that will be needed in a manner that will be sustainable and also affordable, and we won't have poor people who will be left out. So in that context, today's discussion is very much relevant because as countries are developing, one of the great challenges that we will face is how do we really translate that growth into wealth? Because growth is different from wealth, and wealth unfortunately today is just measured in terms of money, but real wealth is in terms of human capital and human welfare or human development broadly. And for that, one of the instruments to distribute that wealth is really address the income inequality or make it equitable. And here is where developed societies have very good lessons, and developing countries and developing economies can actually learn from that. So today's lecture is actually a work in progress, and it is the first of a major book publication that Dr. Pundarik, who will be our speaker, who is leading together with my colleagues at the Global Asia Institute, where we are looking at the experience of Singapore, China, India, and what does it mean for the future of Asia. So today's lecture by Dr. Pundarik Mukhopadhaya will be about the income inequalities in China. And here is where we also want to look at, question the assumptions and the analysis that have been done in the past, and look at new ways of looking at them, because we cannot get the answers for tomorrow's problems with yesterday's theories and hypotheses. We need to also be brave enough to challenge some of the assumptions and the theories that we have had so far. So in that context, we are also very happy that we have our colleague from the East Asia Institute, Professor Zheng Yongnyang, who will join us later after Dr. Pundarik's presentation to give our own perspectives on to how we are looking at these trends. I'm not going to take time to introduce each of them. These are available in the introduction to you. Now I'll request Dr. Pundarik to first make his presentation for about 30 minutes or so. Then we will have a panel discussion. Dr. Pundarik, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Professor Sitaram. Because of his interest and support, I am here, and his research, and this research has taken the present shape. Other GAI staff were extremely helpful and supportive throughout. I would like to thank Professor Bhanuji Rao, who continuously guided me on inequality research over the past 2 decades. I am also grateful to Professor Zeng, who, despite his busy schedule, has agreed to be with us here and share his wisdom. The Chinese economy has grown rapidly since the founding of the People's Republic. National income increased 36 times since 1952 in constant prices, while per capita gross domestic product increased over 16 times. Economic growth was much faster since the 1978 reforms. With rapid economic growth, income inequality had also grown. Today, I discuss some findings of my research on income inequality in China. I am sure the term Gini coefficient is quite familiar to you as a popular measure of inequality. The value of Gini reaches 1, the maximum, when one person in a society receives everything and others nothing. While if everyone gets equal share of the total national income, the value of Gini reaches the minimum, that is 0. We consider a Gini of 0.45 or above as high. Argentina, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Turkey, El Salvador, Honduras, Chile, Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Brazil, Guatemala are examples of some of the countries where Gini is high. To explore income inequality in China, I have disaggregated the Gini coefficient into rural, urban, and regional subgroups. Furthermore, I have decomposed the Gini into components of income such as wage salaries, household operations, transfer payments, etc. Our analysis is based on the data available from China Statistical Yearbook 1981 to 2009. These publications are brought out by the China National Bureau of Statistics. The earliest distributional data available to us are for 1980 for rural areas and 1981 for the urban areas. For the calculation of total inequality of 1980, we combined rural 1980 data with the urban 1981 data. Household is the unit of my study. The sample size used in the official survey is provided in this slide. Our analysis is based on group per capita household disposable or net income data. The data sources provide information of mean income of various income groups for rural and urban areas by province, but there is no information about the distribution around the means. Therefore, it suffers from some underestimation, which is unavoidable in the absence of microdata. To get the rural-urban population weights for each region, I used the China population statistics for various years. Rural and urban residents refer to the status registered in the household register system. This system prevents or discourages people to move from one place to another. After the success of rural reform, when many workers were freed from agricultural activities, they moved to urban areas in search of higher incomes. Some floating migrants are not covered in the NBS samples. This creates some bias in our calculation. As for income data, many in-kind subsidies and social security benefits are not captured as part of household income for urban residents. In the last 10 years or so, the social security system in China has been reformed notably to raise the contribution of both employees and employers to social insurance programs. This contributes to the underestimation of urban income. Despite the various limitations of household income measurement, it is clear from the evidence that underestimation is less than 5% and would not be unduly influence our inequality measures and comparisons. According to our estimates, total Gini in China has been increasing, moving up from 0.327 in 1980-81 to 0.508 in 2008. The rural Gini increased at an exponential rate of 1.2%, while the urban Gini rose at a rate of 2.7%. Besides the presence of migrants, which is a more recent phenomenon, the rich-poor chasm in the urban region in China does persist because of unemployment, which aggravated in the period of transition from socialist to market economy. Furthermore, Professor Martin King White of Harvard University and Chunping Han indicate in the book Creating Wealth and Poverty in Post-Socialist China, I quote, "Many who felt should have been honored in their contribution to building socialism found themselves unemployed, while suspicion was rife that many of China's new millionaires were the beneficiaries of corruption and official favoritism." Unquote. The transformation process took its toll in the rural areas as well. Classification of land, confiscation of land because of encroaching cities, and widespread unemployment are some of the unfortunate features. According to Professor Suzy Yao of the University of Nottingham, non-agricultural income dominates rural income inequality. Although China has the second largest land territory in the world, relative to the population size, it has an acute shortage of land compared to majority of the developing countries. Thus, rural income cannot depend just on land and agriculture, and the strict policy on rural to urban migration means that there has been a rising population pressure on land. Prosperity of rural areas depends largely on their ability to diversify out of agriculture. In the past 20 years, the prosperous regions in the East were able to develop rural industries rapidly. However, the poor Western regions were left out. The figures in this slide depict that the rural inequality in China is persistently higher than urban inequality, though the gap is decreasing. The figure shows that the urban income are much higher than the rural incomes, and there is a recent dip caused by two independent forces. Firstly, the recent increases in migrants who attract low wage were pulling the average income down in the urban areas. Secondly, there was the inevitable pull down of the urban income in the aftermath of the global crisis. Thus, so far, the results show that the ingredients of high national income inequality in China originate from high income inequality within both rural and urban sectors. Now, we will consider the results of decomposition of the overall Gini into rural and urban subgroups. Although income inequality within the urban and rural areas increased over time, it is difficult to say that one or the other has been the driver of the national Gini's rise. Since the rural population as a whole is clustered over a relatively low level of mean income, it is no wonder that the rural-urban disparity has been the main contributor to the changes of income inequality. The results presented in this table are more informative if we look at column 4. This column presents the overlap term in the Gini decomposition, which indicates the degree of mobility among the rural and urban groups. The percentage contribution of this overlap term has risen significantly in 2008 compared to 2003. I would like to add that this overlap term is quite sensitive to the population share. As there is a continuous change in the rural-urban population share, normalization with respect to changes in population share may be attempted. In 2008, for instance, the normalization will push up the percentage contribution of the overlap to 30% from the 23%. We can demonstrate the importance of factor income in rural and urban inequality for policy recommendation as a potential for decreasing inequality of income. Due to the time constraint, I will present here only the estimates of 2008. We have computed the elasticity of Gini with respect to average income of a particular factor. This will indicate if the share of this particular factor increases, whether it will also increase the total inequality and by how much. A negative value of the elasticity indicates the inequality reducing effect and vice versa. In rural China, household operation is the major component of rural disposable income, while wage income share is also high, around 40%. Income from household operation is inequality reducing, and as the case with transfers. The dominant contributors to inequality being wages and property incomes, there is no easy or quick way out of inequality except by policy-induced increases in transfers and household operations that could particularly help the poor. These may still not help in lowering overall inequality in any significant extent. In the urban sector, the wage and salary income has the maximum share in total disposable income. It turns out that this factor has a high elasticity too, and the implication is quite clear. Further increases in wage share will be inequality augmenting. There is an interesting information to this as well. If rural to urban migration is considered as the much needed option to raise overall living standard and to some extent reduce rural inequality, the policy will only enhance urban inequality. The inequality reducing effect of transfers is once again clarified. We will now turn to the issue of regional inequality, often discussed in Chinese policy circles and media. We have divided China into 6 zones following NBS. These zones are North, Northeast, Central, East, West, and the rest is Northwest. There is a stark regional disparity of rural-urban income gaps. It can be noticed that all regions, without any exception, the diversity decreased. Most in the southwest region, followed by northwest, then come central, northeast, north, and east. However, maximum diversity is still present in the northwest, 2.74, followed by southwest, 2.0, and north, 2.51. The scenario in the eastern region in the last 5 years hovers around the national average. This table presents the decomposition results individually of rural and urban inequality into between regions, within region, and overlap terms. It can be noted that for both rural and urban inequality, the between group component is much higher than the within group components, however decreasing over time. The rate of increase of within group component in the rural sector is much smaller than that for the urban sector. Previously, I had mentioned that the contribution of rural-urban between group inequality was higher than the within group inequality, but decreasing. Now it can be seen that the contribution of within region inequality is much smaller for both the rural and urban inequality than the between region inequality. The major contribution of the regional disparity is the overlap term. The high contribution of between group inequalities in regional decomposition is due to varying growth and development rates of various regions in China. This is the result of concerted development policy of China taken in late 1970s. Although efforts are there to minimize regional disparity, our result in terms of between and within group inequality comparison show only little improvement. In the rural sector, income from household operation and income from wages and salaries contribute the major share in total income. For all the regions except Northwest, wage and salaries are the inequality augmenting factors, while household operation is inequality reducing. Elasticity due to wage is highest in Northeast region, thus special attention is needed for this region. In the urban sector, the Northeast region, the wage salary has an inequality reducing effect. Thus, rural-urban migration in the northeast may have two-pronged effect. It could reduce both urban and rural inequality. So, what we found from our research. The latest inequality figure of 0.5 for China resembles Latin American nations' experience rather than East Asia. Inter-rural and intra-wage inequality is relatively high compared to experience elsewhere. Rural-urban migration is inevitable, but may not help bring about inequality reduction. Policy focus needs to move to inclusive growth. High Gini may be particularly problematic for China since in the past it used equality as the foundation for unity and stability. I don't want to make any casual comment on the causal relationship between inequality and crime, violence, murder, or any other form of social unrest. Some recent news items did bother us a lot. Let me read from Straits Times, May 14th. Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao has urged improved efforts to address long-standing social concerns, which he said were partially to blame for the string of deadly attacks on school children. We need to resolve the deep-seated causes that have resulted in these problems, Mr. Wen said in an interview on Thursday with Hong Kong-based Phoenix Television. This includes handling social contradiction, resolving disputes, and strengthening mediation at the grassroots level. Wen's comment came after a man wielding a kitchen cleaver killed 9 people, including 7 children, in an attack at a kindergarten in northern China in Wednesday, the 5th such attack in just a few weeks. Mr. Wen is the highest level leader to acknowledge that social issues could be behind the spate of attack that have highlighted such concerns at the widening wage gap, widespread official corruption, and abuse of power. Experts have said the latest attacks show that China is paying the price for focusing on economic growth for decades while ignoring mental health problems linked to the nation's rapid social change. Perhaps these sort of unrest were there even in the past, however, had not been reported. I can only say that 0.5 Gini is quite high. Thank you.
Audience to, first of all, prepare questions. I see already some hands up. So what we're going to do is, before I ask Dr. Zheng to make his comments, we'll collect some questions so Dr. Pundarik can prepare his response.
Okay, inequality figure for China and Latin American 0.5 is not satisfactory according to your research. So what is the period that you are referring to in the past, and what is the coefficient in the past, and what should be the ideal for China? If let's say 0.5 is not satisfactory, what is the figure for the past, and what should be the ideal range from your research? I'd like to know first before I give further comment. Thanks.
Yeah. You didn't introduce yourself, sir.
Patrick. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
My name is Krishna. I'm an academic from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, visiting Asia Research Institute here. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that the path of the development what China has taken in terms of the socialist market economy, according to the international agencies, including World Bank, the rate of the poverty has come down, but income inequality has grown. Would you like to comment on that one, number one? Number two is the clarification that China has a HUCO system in terms of their registration. So, Mike, I just want to have a clarification for the persons, given the large-scale migration from rural to the urban areas, say for the persons who are coming from rural area and working in Beijing, officially how it is recorded? Is the person is recorded in the rural areas or in the urban areas? And how that envelops the kind of the the whole calculations, you know, because there's a huge migration in the cities. Thank you.
Now I'm going to hand it to Dr. Zheng to first make his opening comments, substantive comments. He'll take a few minutes to comment. In that time, I request at least 3 more people to prepare their questions so that after Dr. Pundarik answers the first 2 questions, then we'll have 3 more questions. So please prepare your questions while I request Professor Zheng to make his initial reaction, substantive comments on the entire presentation and some views of your own views and your institute's views on these issues that we presented.
Okay, thank you. I can't take my personal view. Our institute, we have 4 groups from political, economic, social, different perspective, or even international perspective. Well, thank you, Dr. Pundarik, for such a wonderful presentation. I think it's really is one of the key issues China now facing. China is facing. I always say, when I was in Europe, I always tell my colleagues, China now is the biggest lab for all social scientists. And everything, whatever, coming in your mind is happening in China. So you can retest or, establish a hypothesis in social sciences. So I'm glad, Dr. Pundarik previously, he focused on non-China issue. Now he came into China field. That's a wonderful sign. Because it's particularly for this subject, income equality, of course, it's important for China. As Dr. Pundarik mentioned, Wen Jiabao mentioned many times, right? If China cannot control income inequality, the society will become a very problem. But I think this issue also now is become an issue with global significance, because the Chinese government has decided to build a consumer society. If China cannot solve the problem to build a more equal society, I don't think China is able to build a consumer society. A portion of society overconsumed, and then the majority of people under consumed, and that's the problem. The government over the year, I think since Deng Xiaoping came to power in the late 1970s, so he has a slogan, to become rich is glorious, right? And to let a part of population to get rich first. I think he was a very wise man, because if you want economic development, you must be able to motivate people. So to allow a portion of some population to get rich first is a good way, very effective way to move society going. Because on the Qianmen Mall, I think China was a very equal society, but everyone was poor. Everyone was poor. So the Gini coefficient was low. So I would say that's a very bad equality, not good, because then society, of course, Deng Xiaoping was so powerful, to move Chinese society forward. Then I would say under Deng Xiaoping, in the mid-1980s, China economic reform got a difficulty. Then Deng Xiaoping said we should engage in political reform. Well, political reform, of course, Deng Xiaoping failed, because there was a Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement in 1989. Then in the 90s, the leadership, of course, changed their mind. Because of the fall of the Soviet Union and the East European communism. Then Deng Xiaoping made a good judgment. Why the Soviet Union collapsed, or the East European communism collapsed? Because those governments were not able to move economy going, to develop their economies, to deliver economic goods to their people. So the whole period of Jiang Zemin, the Chinese government was very much pro-capital. The government had a whole series of policies, laws, regulations in favor of capital. That's why now the income inequality become a structural problem, because you look at the Chinese law, look at the Chinese policies, all those are in favor of capital, not in favor of the people. Then only until Wu Jintao and Wen Jiabao came into power in 2002, the government has been trying to shift its policy from pro-capital to pro-people. So in recent years, of course, the Chinese government has been trying to have a whole series of social policy reform to deal with the income inequality issues. But still, I would say, now of course China also facing in international pressure. Yesterday, China, United States, this economic and strategic dialogue was closed. I think one of the issues they discussed is, I think, income equality, because the U.S. say, come on, you export you have export too much. You really have to increase domestic consumption, but with a huge income inequality, China, of course, is difficult to increase domestic consumption. So I think China is facing also increasing high international pressure. But now my question is actually quite similar with the guy he mentioned. There's a good inequality or bad inequality. But for example, yesterday I published a newspaper piece, and Singapore's Gini coefficient also is quite high, but we don't see the sign of social instability in Singapore. Well, why? China's Gini coefficient is almost the same level as Singapore, but we feel we are concerned with China's social instability. So I think we have to. I wonder whether Dr. Pandru has in your research whether you have identified the source of income inequality. Only we found the source of Gini coefficient, then we can think about the solution. Because I know the Chinese government, also including Premier Wen Jiabao, realized the serious problem of income inequality, but they're thinking about how to solve the issue, how to make the society more equal. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was a good comment to supplement and give a bigger, broader perspective from the political and the policy agenda of the Chinese government to the presentation that Dr. Pundarik made. So you have 3 questions now, because he also made one more question. So would you want to start responding to them while we'll have 3 more lined up for you?
Yeah, I will start from the guy who asked the first question, Patrick. In the literature of income inequality, there is nothing called optimal income inequality. So what Professor Zeng was mentioning, that fair income inequality and bad income inequality, yes. Recently, in the sociology literature, people are talking about that. Professor Martin King White is trying to do some sociological experiment on a small sample in Beijing with these questions, that whether it is a fair inequality or unfair inequality. But we will consider, I personally will consider, it is subjective, that whether this inequality is good or bad, but I personally will consider Gini below 0.35 will be tolerable. However, Gini around 0.5 is not tolerable. And you had another question on the equality, inequality condition in the past. I can read for you. I have the measurement starting from 1981. 1981 Gini is 0.309. 1982 Gini was 0.285. 1983 0.282. 1984 0.291. 1985 to 89 it hovers around 0.28. And then it started increasing in 1992, 0.39. Then 1993, 0.41. 1994, 0.43. 1995, 0.41. 1998, 0.40. 1999, 0.42. 2000, 0.43. 2001, 0.44. I think these were your 2 questions. And then coming to Professor Krishnan's question, income inequality versus poverty. Now, what poverty you are looking at, absolute poverty or relative poverty? If it is relative poverty, then income inequality and relative poverty, these 2 concepts are the same concept. If you are focusing on a particular target group, then it is absolute poverty. And as just now Professor Zeng mentioned, that it is possible everyone is poor, but income distribution is perfect. It is possible. That is, everyone could be absolutely poor, theoretically. So that's the distinction between income inequality and poverty. And your other question was on the hukou system. How NBS captured people. NBS definition tells that if the person is out of the household for 6 months and sending money to the family, sending the major portion of their income to the rural family, then the person will be considered in the rural registration. If the person is out, not person, the whole household is out for 1 year or more, then the person and the family, the household, will not be considered under the rural population. So, as I mentioned in my lecture, that there are few floating people who are not included in the NBS. I have seen NBS corrected studies as well. NBS does not allow us to do that, but there is another database called China Household Income Survey Database that allows the rectification of migration, but after rectification the value changed by less than 2%. That's why I felt that perhaps that would be not worthwhile to consider.
Well, thank you very much, Prof. First and foremost, thank you very much for the opportunity in this context of the civic engagement. I think in the China context, I think I'm quite worried because I'm non-Chinese. So I think I've got to observe the fundamental, that is to say that, according to Lao Tzu, for example, those who have knowledge don't predict. And those who predict are those without knowledge. So I'm without both. I'm not a predictor, nor am I having the kind of knowledge that you have. But having said that, because I think that you did not provide us with your enlightenment of the definition when you say inequalities. In what sense? Economic numbers alone? No, it cannot be, because what concerns China and external parties right now is the political dimension. So the question is that inequalities, from my definition, would be they have and they have not. And it is beyond the income dimension, but I think it is including the non-income dimension. So would you be more daring enough to come up with something which is what the world is concerned about, just as the Chinese leadership is concerned about the internal, unthinkable explosion will come by if this, the have-not dimension is not addressed in the best of possibilities, just in line with the 21C, where China is moving to the next new direction. And so I think, would you be willing enough to exert some authority to say what your prediction be as the consequence of the have-not dimension? Thank you.
We could have a lengthy discussion about whether there are lessons for China from Singapore, and I don't want to get into that discussion. I do want to raise a question that arises from points made in the opening chapters of the second volume of Minister Mentor's autobiography, in which he does talk about the relationship between income inequality and social stability. But he doesn't focus so much on structural issues as on an understanding of human nature. He makes 3 points. First, people will be more satisfied if they feel they have a stake in the society, and that involves in particular issues having to do with corruption and fairness. Secondly, he talks, as everybody in this group knows, about the home ownership. We need a home-owning society. And third, he emphasizes the importance of educational opportunity. So even if parents are poor, and even if profligate and irresponsible, that children can get out of the trap that those circumstances have created. This raises the possibility, at least, that you could have relatively high Gini coefficients, but nonetheless a substantial, so the capitalists could have their Bentleys and their Louis Vuitton watches, but you could still have a substantial population with a stake in the society, and policies could focus on those specific kinds of issues rather than trying to deal with it necessarily as an overall structural need for structural change. And I wonder if you could just perhaps both Dr. Zhang and the speaker could comment on that.
Good afternoon. My name is Priyanka. My question is based on something that Professor Dr. Zhang said. You had mentioned that in the early stages of economic development, it will always be a few people who are leading the movement towards economic development, and so there is likely to be a little bit of income inequality. My question is, when do we reach, what is that level of economic development? When do we reach that level where this income inequality is no longer acceptable? Has China reached that stage yet? And if it has, what does it need to do to ensure more equality? Thank you.
Okay. I think that for most of these answers would be coming from Professor Zhang. However,
you're the speaker.
However, my answers on this income inequality and economic inequality. Well, when I came into the profession of economics many years back, I had encountered questions from everywhere that do you know when our economy will do better? Why there is a crisis? Why don't you predict for that? These questions we always face. But to be frank, as an economist, what we generally try to do, we try to we don't make policies. Rather, we try to use a scientific method to find out the results of the current policy and perhaps could indicate that future policies, what those future policies could do. So we give in front of the policymakers the big spreadsheet that if the policy is this, then this is the result. Or if the policy is that, that could be the result. And in a more scientific way, precisely, that's what I tried to do in my research. I didn't respond, rather I forgot to respond Professor Zhang's question that what are the sources of inequality. So my later slides were showing that what were the sources of inequality. The sources, the total income, had been desegregated into parts, both for rural and urban economy, like wage salaries, like household income, like transfer payments. And I have seen both for rural and urban economy that if the share of the wage income increases, by exactly what percentage the total inequality will increase or decrease. Now what I have seen, that if the wage share increases in the rural economy or in the urban economy, the inequality as a whole will increase. So that means what? If there is a free migration, if people move from urban to rural, rural to urban area, then what sort of job they can get? They can get initially, let's assume that they are unskilled, at the lower end of the income ladder. So that will increase the income share, the wage share. However, that will increase the wage inequality as well. And what will happen? That because of this migration, total inequality will explode. Similarly, if there is a higher portion of transfer payment allowed by government, the inequality will reduce. Now, I have in my slides the exact figure over the years, how much percentage of total income goes as the form of transfer payment. That is very little. So if there is a 1% increase in transfer payment, then that will perhaps reduce the total Gini by 0.00 some percent of Gini in the total national framework. So that's what I wanted to show and I wanted to see. Now on economic inequality, I am sure that that is a much more wider concept, and there are many other things to consider beyond income, and I do that as well. However, the information is limited on that. And in a scientific research, we cannot get a definite answer on this. We can tell that this is right, this could be right, this should be done, but nothing more than that. But this precisely, if we want to say, then we need to have information. And that information is not available with us. That's why I couldn't go into a wider concept of economic inequality. But I would love to go for that if the information is available. On the structural problem, yes, there are structural problems, and I believe Professor Zeng would like to respond to that, because it is a more political economy question.
The last question.
The last question is also... sorry, I surrender.
No, I'm not an economist, so I would say, yes, those are very good questions, and I think, first of all, I would like to see some structural problem of China's income inequality in Chinese words. There are four characteristics of China as income inequality, what Chinese people are talking about now. First of all, it's a so-called rich state and poor people. The government is so rich, but people are poor. Right? For example, I have some figure. The proportion of government budgetary revenue in the total GDP increased from 11% to 20% in the past 20 years. If extra budgetary revenue was added, this proportion has reached 30%. So the government deposit, government savings, was increased from 178 billion yuan in 1999 to 1,696 billion in 2008, 10 times. So also China's corporate savings will increase from 12% of the total GDP in 1998 to 23% in 2007. But the household savings remains the same, 20% over period. So people talk about Chinese household saving high, actually not so high, 20% always. Then second characteristic is rich fewer and the poor majority. A minority and a handful of people are too very rich, but the majority poor. For example, per hour wage for workers in China is 20 cents US dollar, compared to $25, $30 in the United States or European states. According to a report released by China's National Trade Union April this year, from 1997 to 2007, the labor wage was decreased from 53% of the total GDP to 39% of GDP. By contrast, corporate net revenue increased from 21% of the total GDP to 32% during the same period. So this is quite a big difference. Huh? So the third characteristic is rich city and poor countryside. As you mentioned, I don't want to repeat. A fourth characteristic, also structure. Very rich big corporation, big enterprise, and very poor small and medium enterprises. For example, since after the financial crisis, the Chinese government had this 4 trillion package, stimulus package, but the majority of the money has gone to the state-owned enterprise, big firms. For example, I have a figure here. In the first half of 2009, the SOE sector, which consists of only 1% of the total firms in China, received 91% of bank loan. And the private sector only received 8.2%. So this, I think, this is a big structural problem because all this because the state sector, is a big problem for China. We have seen, I think, the state sector. Of course, the state sector played a very important role for China, the recovery from economic crisis, because the state sector has been the tool for the government to enforce this package of stimulus package. Nevertheless, of the state sector, because they use administrative power, political power to get money from the government. So the private sector is trouble. So this is the problem. Then you mentioned when the level of income equality become acceptable, I think it's not the absolute level, because this is, I would say, in China, this income equality somehow is a policy-driven phenomena. If people, at least for the majority of people up there, of course, culturally, China is a Confucian society which very much emphasis on equality. Then Chairman Mao's egalitarianism again reinforced this ideology. So people, the sense of equality is still very strong. Then why in the 80s or in the 90s, and the level of income inequality was accepted to people, because people got, how to say, that time economy was growing, people got a lot of opportunities. But now, why in recent years, people got so much complaint because the opportunity is not there, especially for young people. And in 10 years ago, when you were university graduate, you got a lot of opportunity to get rich to make money. But now, what I think because of the growth become increasingly exclusive, not inclusive. That inclusive growth become make people unhappy. This is just not level of income equality. What China can learn from Singapore? Yes, of course, China can learn from Singapore a lot. As I mentioned, Singapore's Gini efficiency is still high. The Singapore, because Singapore has a good package, a very effective package of social policy. You have your own apartment, you have Medicare, you have all kinds of things, which China doesn't have. So the problem is, I would say, for China, is to have an effective package of social policy. Then you can control the poverty to maintain social stability. Otherwise, it's probably China will become another Thailand, or with society become too divided.
Earlier, you also mentioned about diversified agricultural production, because you serve very nice fruits here. So I'm wondering whether, because one of the speakers who discussed, sitting on the left, I never take out his name. Okay, so he said the stimulus package, economic stimulus package, 91% go to state-owned company. So besides that, what are the resources being allocated to the private sector that can actually diversify the agriculture? Let's say it can be packed into dried fruits or even grape wines, because you serve very nice fruits here. So I just take this as example. So this diversification of this agriculture, whether the government play any part to invest more funds into helping technology to be incorporated into the technology to, let's say, produce dry fruits or even grape wines type of thing, that can actually cater to a different season. Like in the winter, they can actually go on for the production for this diversification. So what sort of diversification of agriculture have you been found in your findings? And regarding the Latin American nations, I'd like to know the level of their automation, besides their whether the diversification of their agriculture compared to China, and their level of automation in their agricultural production in the rural state compared to China. When you draw this same level of Gini coefficient of 0.5, but I'd like to know what's the difference in terms of their level of automation and the diversification of agriculture with these Latin American nations and China. What's the comparison? Thanks.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Yi Wei from Raffles Institution. You mentioned that China has experienced greater economic growth and is termed as an emerging power. And so considering its special economic and political context, and it being at a transitional stage from socialist economy to marketing economy, so is it fair to compare Gini coefficient of China to those like more developed countries where the economic and political infrastructure are more developed and mature, as in like using the same standard of 0.35 being tolerable?
Good afternoon, sir. I'm from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. My question is, I probably perceive similar fault planes emerging in India also due to the income inequality. And putting India and China together, we account for probably half of the world population. Do we have enough resources in the world to bring so many people from a lower level of income to the, let's say, to an equal level? Do we have enough resources? And second, would it be an easier thing to do to have a firmer social policy like Singapore, which will probably help hide any kind of inequality that is actually existing in terms of economics?
Okay, Patrick, on your question of the comparison of China's situation with Latin America, I didn't compare the automation facilities of China with respect to the Latin America. That's why I won't be able to give you the right answer for that. But you were mentioning about this processing industry, food processing industry. In my slides, can I go back to my slide?
Oh, sure.
Okay. What you can see from here, that income from household operation, that gives a negative value of relative inequity. The negative value of relative inequity means that if the share of this household operation increases, then the inequality in the rural region will diminish, will decrease. Now, how this income from household operation can be increased by agricultural or non-agricultural activities. Now, if this is either it is agriculture or non-agricultural activity, if that is a wage generating activity, then what will happen, that if share of the wage increases, that will increase the inequality in the rural region. So what is needed in this food processing industries, that if it is a self-employment based food processing industry, that will reduce inequality. But if it is wage increasing, wage share increasing employment, that will increase inequality. That's my result. That does not mean that that policy has to be followed. As that is the result what it is shown. Now there could be a trade-off between these two, and to increase the share here, that if the share here can be increased by using some sort of subsidies, etc., that could negatively affect on this wage salary part. So wage salary may increase, wage salary share may increase, and that will increase. However, this will decrease the total inequality, although this increases the total inequality. So there could be combination of several policies, that the result, as you know, that you cannot have one single policy to have one single action. The policies are combination of policies, and there are direct and indirect effects. So it is the direct effect, but there could be several indirect effects as well. And in that way, the policies has to be spread out over these four sectors. Okay, other two questions were 0.35 Gini, whether that is tolerable or not. Well, when economy grows, then it is possible that inequality increases. However, 0.5 is too much. 0.5 is not tolerable, and some policies are needed to reduce it, even if possible to 0.35 level. Yeah.
I think it's like different countries are at different stage of economic development, right? like you are using the same standard to judge whether it is having income inequality or not. So my question is whether is it a fair judgment or not?
Well, there are many European developed countries where Gini is 0.22. I'm not asking to make Gini to 0.22 or 0.20. So I am somewhere in between. I'm telling 0.45 and above is pretty high. So try to reduce it below 0.40. Not to go to those developed countries you were referring to. So it is quite difficult. I understand that at that stage of development standard, it is difficult while having a high growth rate to reduce inequality. But if it explodes to 0.5, 0.6, that is not acceptable.
Last question. Whether we can fund it.
Well, I don't have sufficient data for that to check that whether billions of people could be funded through government exchequer to take them out of absolute poverty level. That has to be checked.
No, we have come to the end of the session. So I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to ask three people to make quick reactions. Ambassador Redding, Professor Banojirao, and the Dean of the Overseas Family School who've kindly come here. You can give some general comments or reactions, then we will wrap up the session. Please give a mic to them.
I would like to thank the Institute for organizing these kinds of lunch series. As I said when I came here, I said I was embarrassed because I didn't know the Institute before, and it was my curiosity to come here in order to get to know the Institute and to get to know what kind of people. I think an institute is always made of human beings, and I think we have top quality people here. In my previous job, I have done a lot in development cooperation. As I told, I was in charge in Switzerland of Switzerland's program in the World Bank, the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and there was a governor of the Asian Development Bank there. For this kind of subject is a subject which is close to me. I think when we speak about economic development, I think income is one aspect, but I think there are other aspects, and specifically the involvement of the people in the politics, in the society, in how they can interact with their livelihood around it. And I think we have to keep in mind that income is one. It leads probably also to be deeper involved in other aspects of life, but it's only one element of it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to the Institute for welcoming us and our group of students from the Overseas Family School. I think it's been a good presentation, and we appreciate it very much. To look at the economics, the economic inequality as a part of a much larger series of issues that our students will be, have been and will be considering regarding economics, the impact of economics on political change, China, Olympic China and a post-Olympic period in China, as we consider other kinds of issues relating to China, relating to Asia, Tibet, the Uyghur area. We look forward to a soon-to-be presentation on Thailand, that it would be possible for our students to and I try to encourage them, as another important 20th century political figure said, everything is connected to everything. To be able to understand and try to hold all of these separate pieces and see them as a larger whole. The economics, economic inequality, when is it acceptable, when is it unacceptable, when does it build a critical mass for change, and possibilities of what can be done about it. So for us, speaking for our students, that this is a very important step in the learning cycle for us, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rao.
Well, as you know, in the Lee Kuan Yew School, we always have 3 points. First of all, I must say that this session has gone beyond my expectations. Professor Zhang, thank you so much. I learned a lot. Dr. Pundarik, thank you so much. My second point is, in the last 35 years of my understanding of income inequality, both in the university here in Bukit Timah, in the World Bank in Washington, in Kentridge, and now back in Bukit Timah, I have understood the following. Like the texture of the terrain, countries have to live with their own inequality level. And they have to come to terms with that. Now, how Singapore has done, it may not help. You cannot have a 0.5 in Switzerland. They decided long ago, this is how we live. So I have come to the tentative conclusion, because remember in social sciences everything is tentative. I have come to the tentative conclusion that countries have to live with a certain inequality level. And there will be signals from the society if it is unacceptable. You know, in a democracy you change the government. In China probably they change the leader or they change the policy framework. My third and final point is, I want people to kindly forgive all those who do research on income inequality, because none of them have control on those numbers. The worst question in terms of sample surveys, and anybody who has soiled his or her hands in sample surveys knows very well, the worst question is income. In fact, the rich and famous, I used to tell my students in Bukit Timah, when I was teaching statistics, don't ever try to take the questionnaire and go to the bungalow, because the Alsatian dog will greet you. So we just live with the data. But I'm very happy to point out, and I'm really delighted that Pundarik has done this little experiment and found out that maybe about 3%, 5% is all that is missing. So at the end of the day, I say, I'm so grateful that this session has gone so well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. On that note, let's wrap up the session. There were many interesting points that were made, and Dr. Pundarik brought out the importance of income to understand how society is performing. And he actually commented in his closing remarks, bringing the Wenjiabao's statement about corruption and having a clean government, and which is what Professor Richardson was pointing to about Singapore's experience. So a clean government and providing good governance at the highest level is a good societal signal. Then the rest of the non-income substitutes do come in, and Singapore picked some of them, like housing. Education is a well-accepted paradigm. Many of the developed societies do have across the board the substitute and support for education to bring inequality to better levels among the society. So all these are good lessons for us to look at, and we can look forward to the policies that China will adopt. And as I said, this is a work in progress to compare also the experience of other countries, including India, and then a book will come out, as I understand. So on that note, let's wrap up this session. I request you all to join me to give a round of applause to both Pundarik and Dr.